Now, the Omicron variant was first identified here in South Africa, and epidemiologists around the world are watching our COVID infection levels with great interest. It seems there's slightly newer versions of Omicron that are pushing our infection numbers up. Let's get a sense of what that means and also the plans by health officials to mitigate the rising numbers. Western Cape Head of Health, Dr. Keith Glitter, joins me now. Doc, thank you so much. Always good to talk to you. So if we look at the latest numbers, and we know that Monday traditionally is a time when the numbers are quite low, but if we look week on week, what is it telling you about when this fifth wave is actually going to hit us?
We have been seeing a rapid increase in cases over the last 7 to 10 days in South Africa. And as you rightfully pointed out, it's mainly driven by Gauteng, KZN in the Western Cape. There's a mathematical calculation of saying when we enter the fifth wave, and it's normally when we reach about a third of the cases that we've had in the previous wave. So it is probably a couple of weeks off. But the NICD is very much looking at it, and the rapid increase is pointing to us that it's imminent in terms of for the country.
All right, so we're getting there. Since South Africa discovered Omicron late last year, I think there have been about 4 variations of Omicron that have been picked up, and they're known as BA 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. I just want to ask you to unpack a little bit, though. Earlier this last month, lab studies by Dr. Alex Siegel showing that these newer variations, particularly BA 4 and 5, are actually, it seems, getting through our antibody immunity a lot more easily than Omicron. We do still hope that the T cells, which is the second level, is going to look after us. But how concerned are you about that piece of research?
I think this is quite an interesting phenomenon, and that's why the world is watching, Sally, because Professor Tullio de Oliveira also made these observations that we have seen BA1, we've seen BA2, 3, and now BA4 and 5. BA4 and 5 over the last 3 or 4 weeks has been responsible for the increase in cases that we're seeing. And it being a subvariant of Omicron, it just indicates that because of the changes in BA4 and 5, and because we had the Omicron, which is mainly caused by BA1 in December, we are already now 4 months after that. So therefore, it's an indication that even if people were infected by BA1, there's waning immunity for that protection 4 months later, which makes them vulnerable, even if you had BA1, that you can get BA4 and BA5 now. But as you rightfully point out, that is for getting the infection. Our bigger hope, and we are still making that assumption, that a bigger protection is the T cells, which is for the underlying protection, both from previous infection and also from vaccine coverage that protects us against severe disease. So as we're seeing the increasing in cases, it's a very interesting phenomenon because there was a big expectation that our fifth wave will be driven by a completely novel variant, a different variant, and that people were using the word pi, for instance. But this would seem that 4 and 5, BA4 and 5, is driving this fifth wave, which is interesting because it might be that we're seeing a new direction for Omicron and for COVID, and that will unfold over the coming weeks.
Is that necessarily good news? I mean, does that mean that we're likely to see the decoupling that we all talk about that we saw in the fourth wave, where infection numbers were high, but people weren't landing up in hospital and people were not dying at the rate that they were in previous waves?
The decoupling was there mainly because in our country, we've had, if you take people's antibodies just before the fourth wave, and we did some antibody tests, and it was repeated in other parts of the country as well, that there was about 90% protection. And that 90% protection was a combination of being either fully vaccinated or have had previous infection. And because of that 90% protection, we had quite a high spike for Omicron, but we had protection against severe disease, and therefore we saw the decoupling quite starkly in the fourth wave. Fewer admissions, not no admissions, but fewer, and fewer deaths, also still for people that were at most vulnerable, and those were the ones that didn't have previous infection or weren't vaccinated at the time. So we still believe that in the fifth wave, that the working assumption is that with BA4 and 5, we will still have the same protection against severe disease. Therefore, we expect lower hospitalization figures and lower death rates.
We know that the Western Cape province has now come up with a plan, and I would imagine this is an attempt to create certainty, that when you hit certain numbers, you are on certain levels. Just talk us through that plan and whether you are able to put in those limitations independently of the rest of the country, because we know, of course, that the pandemic is now going to fall under the Department of Health and not a national state of disaster.
So thanks, Sally. So what we actually learned is in the second wave, and you will recall that was December 2020, quite a significant wave. That was the beta wave. We started working with the premise that if we reach a certain level of cases, which then is associated with a certain level of hospitalizations, when we get certain levels and oxygen use, we then trigger a response for more preparedness because of the algorithmic increase of cases. What we found in the third wave, which was the Delta wave, we refined those markers. And when we got to the fourth wave, we refined it even further. And because of the decoupling, our trigger system is very much now on new admissions or admissions into hospital and oxygen use. And because of those things are such sensitive markers, we can now pick up very quickly when admission starts increasing. And when it hits a certain level, we trigger a response for preparedness for more beds, more oxygen, more ambulance, EMS transport, and what we're saying then more, I would call it readiness and preparedness of the society to start doing some kind of restrictive behavior, like wearing masks, like avoiding gatherings, and doing a whole lot of things. Now, we don't intend it to be that the Western Cape will do it alone. These were actually adopted by the Ministerial Advisory Committee based on our inputs in the third and the fourth wave. And it has been part of a Ministerial Advisory Committee advisory, actually, that everybody else in the country should follow a similar approach. So we're very much working with the National Department. We know that the draft amended regulations is supposed to take effect. There's a lot of comments that have come in, and probably in the next week or so, there has to be clarity on what exactly the regulations will look like, when it will take effect. And because in the Western Cape, we are taking the guidance as the health department, we have got all the other sectors in the Western Cape working with us. So we're not just triggering hospital beds and those things, but we're also saying we need to trigger a response in schools that is responsible, in sporting, in business, in cultural affairs. So we're working with all our sectors in the Western Cape.
All right, and as I'm reading through, you've got 4 levels. So level 1 is 10% of hospital beds occupied by COVID. Level 2 is 20%. It also looks at oxygen usage. Level 3 is 50%. Level 4 is 80% hospitalization. And that, at that point, you would say, let's close our schools. But the last wave, we didn't even get through 1%, level 1, did we?
So in the last wave, that's why we're saying we tested this very well. But because we have to be vigilant and be agile and ready, just in case, every time somebody thinks they know everything about Omicron, a curveball might come our way. And that's why we are prepared, we are vigilant, and if the worst case scenario or a middle case scenario unfolds, we will respond accordingly.
Well, thank you so much for chatting to us this evening. Western Cape Head of Health, Dr. Keith Klutter.